Thank you for joining us for our Agri-Pulse Washington Week in Review. I'm Spencer Chase, joined as always by Agri-Pulse Senior Editor Phil Brasher, discussing the week that was, agriculturally speaking, in Washington, D.C. And the big news in Washington this week is obviously Senate efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act. But we promised there were still some agricultural things that happened this week. We'll be sure to summarize those for you quickly here. And the first thing we want to mention is a marathon hearing that happened in the Senate Agriculture Committee on Tuesday. 17 witnesses, a number of panels, all of them bringing their opinions before the Senate Agriculture Committee, and kind of a brief discussion that happened there really could loom large here in the coming months. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, obviously occupied with other things this week as the Senate is debating healthcare law, took a trip to the Senate Agriculture Committee, of which he is a member, but rarely makes appearances at hearings, to introduce introduce a witness from his home state of Kentucky. And Phil, a very brief exchange revealed that the Senate Agriculture Committee and the Senate chamber might be looking to move a farm bill before the end of the year.
Yeah, there's been in the context of this, there's been some concern, some buzz around town that maybe the Senate wasn't that intent on actually passing a farm bill in this Congress, because after all, we're already in July. There's a light business schedule the rest of this year, and then pretty soon in 2018 you started getting into the midterm campaigns for the midterm election. So from some meetings and so forth, there was a definite concern about the timetable in the Senate. But as you mentioned, Pat Roberts, and it was sort of a lighthearted exchange with the Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who, by the way, I would say at least a couple of times referred to how he wanted to do a 2018 farm bill. This was Mitch McConnell talking about a 2018 farm bill. So that's important. Those little clues can be important. But also Senator Roberts, the chairman of the committee, said he was very eager to get started on it, wanted to do it sooner rather than later, trying to provide some assurance to farm groups and saying it's important to provide, told reporters this as well after the hearing, that it's important to provide some stability, predictability to agriculture by passing a new farm bill.
So once both chambers return from their August recess, that'll be something that's important to watch, is how the timing works out, both in the House and the Senate, of when they're planning to bring a farm bill, both before the full committees and before the floors of those respective chambers. Mm-hmm. But also something that came out of that committee was a very brief exchange regarding, and they didn't specifically say the name Sam Clovis, but it was regarding Sam Clovis, discussion that Ranking Member Stabenow, who has been public about her opposition, or potential opposition, and concern is probably a better way to put it, to the nomination of Sam Clovis to have a full-time job at the Department of Agriculture in a Senate-appointed capacity. She also mentioned that he has had raised questions about the constitutionality of crop insurance, and Chair Pat Roberts didn't really seem to be too fond of that position.
Well, basically Roberts said a nominee who takes that position simply might as well not show up, to paraphrase him. Now, Sam Clovis, as I think many of you all remember, was a chief advisor to the Trump campaign. He was a radio talk show host at one time in Iowa and a college professor out of Northwest Iowa. He, during a campaign for the Senate, he had questioned the constitutionality of crop insurance as well as other forms of subsidies. That's the issue now. At a roundtable last fall here in D.C., he had made a point of saying that President Trump views crop insurance and commodity programs as a national security issue. And that's what USDA folks at USDA pointed to after this exchange at the hearing.
Mm-hmm. And so also something to note, as we sit here recording this video right now, we have not seen the formal submission of the nominations for Sam Clovis and Ted McKinney to the Senate. We have seen the nomination for Steve Censky to the Senate Agriculture
One
Committee.
Correction there. Sam Clovis's did go to the...
I stand corrected.
I'm not sure that they have the full paperwork for it. They do for Steve Censky, who's the nominee for Deputy Secretary. But now Clovis's has gone up. At least the nomination has gone up to the Senate, so that's ready. It's going to be a while. It'll be most likely September at the earliest before the Senate Agriculture Committee actually gets around to, has time to start considering these nominations and moving them. So Sonny Perdue's gone a long time without much help.
And he's going to go a little longer.
Yeah, right. Just to emphasize the importance of having the Deputy Secretary, the Undersecretaries, these Senate-confirmed nominees in place. These are the people that have to make the decisions about regulations, about farm. You have to have these political appointees in place to make the big decisions. Until you have the Undersecretary, you generally don't have the administrators as well, who don't need Senate confirmation, but they are also very critical to running these agencies and making important decisions.
And we want to close with something that happened here on Thursday afternoon, that being a joint statement from both Congress and the White House on tax reform. As many of you may know, congressional efforts on tax reform have been behind the scenes at this point. We've been hearing that they were going to do something by the August recess. That's not going to happen. I feel very confident in reporting that. But there has been talk of a desire to do some kind of tax reform before the end of the year. And a big linchpin of the House tax reform plan has been a border adjustment tax that is said to have been very concerning to some folks that are bringing goods in from other countries into the United States, because basically a tariff is assessed at the border under the border adjustment tax. And that's been a fairly controversial issue. And in this joint statement from the White House and Congress, it was sort of agreed that the border adjustment tax should not be part of tax reform.
Well, it did a couple of things. One, what it essentially did is it applied business taxes to where goods are sold, not where they're made, which is the way things work now. So for agriculture, it meant that it could increase the cost of farm inputs that are imported into the country. For companies that are exporting commodities and so forth, it would mean that they would not be taxed on exported on their exports. The big thing for the House Republicans who wanted this is it raises a lot of money, maybe $1.5 trillion, that they can then use to offset big cuts in business taxes. Now, they're taking it off the table, so they don't have that revenue source. But I will say another major revenue source they're looking at is eliminating the deductibility of interest expenses for businesses. But the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee over in the House, Kevin Brady, has assured us that farmers would be taken care of. There would still be a small business exemption that would allow farmers to continue deducting their borrowing costs. That's a huge issue. We'll be continuing to follow that, obviously, as this issue develops.
So we'll be continuing to follow tax reform efforts, as well as in the next week. The House Agriculture Committee is currently scheduled to have some listening sessions both in Texas and Minnesota, and we'll be sure to monitor those as well and bring you all of the news and information that comes from those on Agri-Pulse.com. But I think that's going to do it for this week's video. So for Phil Brasher, I'm Spencer Chase. Have a good one.